Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webinar from cpaacademy.org. My name is Jasmine, and I'll be your moderator for today's event, Diversity and Inclusion One-on-One, Women in Accounting, Changing the Story. Our presenter today is Jina Etienne with special guest Rosie Brammer. Before we get started, though, I just want to do a quick check to make sure everyone can hear my voice and see the title slide of the presentation on screen. Please head over to the questions box on your GoToWebinar side panel and let me know that you can hear my voice and see the title slide. Also, please let me know what city you're listening in from. I'd love to know where our attendees are from all over the world. Now, while we collect those responses, please also note this is where you'll let me know if you have any technical issues during the broadcast or have any comments or questions for our presenter. Looks like we've got people listening in from Cleveland, Little Rock, Southern Cal, Philadelphia, Austin, Albuquerque. Hi. Awesome. Now that we know everything's working, let's go through some housekeeping. This is a 1 CPE credit webinar, and the way you earn that credit is fairly straightforward. Just stay logged in for 50 minutes and answer the poll questions. We'll have 4 polls, and to earn full credit, you'll need to answer at least 3 of them. Finally, an archived recording of today's webinar along with your CPE credit will be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. We also recommend that you download today's presentation materials, which can be found in the Control Panel's Handouts tab. Now that we're all set, let's welcome our presenter. Jina, our attendees are ready, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jasmine. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. I'm happy to have you back with us for another edition of D&I One-on-One. By the way, I noticed somebody here is from Hershey, Pennsylvania, and may I just say you should go to Hershey because there are yummy things there. Sorry, immediately getting distracted, but back to the topic. Today, I'm talking with Rosie Brammer, a CPA. And Rosie and I met earlier this year. We were introduced by one of my mentors and champions and friends, Jim Metzler. When Jim says someone are good peeps or is good peeps, I trust him. And that's exactly what he said about Rosie. Rosie was the moderator of a panel discussion at the Engage conference this past summer about women in leadership. But more than that, she was the inspirer. That session was inspired by her, and I was part of that panel. It was a great discussion. I found it very encouraging, and that's why I'm so happy to be able to continue the conversation with you today. So thank you, Rosie, for joining.
Thank you, Jina. I'm super excited to be here.
You know, the first question I always want to ask, I'm going to throw it right back to you then to kick this off. When we were planning for this and we were thinking about what we wanted to approach, the concept of changing the story for women in the profession, why was that so important to you, this conversation?
I volunteer with a lot of women's initiatives programs. So I volunteer with the AICPA Women's Initiative Committee and the Oregon Women's Initiative Committee. And it's through the sharing of stories and experiences that I find so inspiring. And the sharing is what can change future stories too. So when we were working together on that Engage session, hearing a lot of your stories, Jina, has impacted mine a lot. Going out on my own, hearing your bravery and your story of starting your own firm. I just started mine 3 weeks ago. So brand new, but hearing your story and your journey, it's part of sharing stories creates bravery too.
Well, thank you for sharing that with me, because I remember when we were talking about this, I had no idea. I was sharing those stories because I was trying to help us brainstorm what to talk about in that panel. So I really appreciate you sharing that with me. It means a lot. So let me look at this list of topics. So for our discussion today, this isn't intended to be an agenda, but it's really just the kinds of stuff that we wanted to talk about, or I should say you wanted to talk about. So gender bias, barriers. And so what are those barriers? Understanding the barriers. What are some things employers can do to address those barriers? And then what are the different types of supports that we can offer women in the profession? And finally, the power of stories. I mean, when we say story, it's such a broad term. So what do we mean by that? Now, before we get in trouble by our attendees, I think we should launch a very first polling question.
My pleasure. I'll go ahead and launch that first poll now. It is live on your screen. This first poll asks, according to the most recent AICPA gender survey, what percentage of CPA firm partners or owners are women? Go ahead and choose from those 5 options on your screen.
That reminds me, I wanted to have some data open. There was some very interesting data that we were looking at as part of our panel discussion. So I'm going to pull some of that up. I don't want you to give it away, Rosie. But when you looked at this data for the first time, were you surprised by it without giving away the answer?
Was I surprised by it?
Yeah.
No. It is interesting looking at just data of gender ratios graduating from accounting programs to the percentage in leadership, ownership roles in the profession.
Yeah.
It's different. It changes somewhere along the journey. It changes pretty substantially.
So let's see, where are we in time? I think we're at that point where we close it. I want to write down the results.
Yes, we are. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll down in 3, 2, 1. Would you like me to share the answers?
Yes, please.
While the majority got it correct, it is 23%. The amount of women graduating from accounting programs is around 50%, a little bit higher than 50% in some of the newest survey results. So there's a drop-off between those graduating with accounting degrees and those who go into leadership roles in public accounting firms. Now that survey is looking at public accounting firms only, like looking at the partnership and shareholder roles. And it is, the most recent data was from 2019, and we've had a heck of a world the last, 18 months?
Absolutely.
So we're excited to see, I believe the next AICPA gender survey will hopefully go out in 2022. So hopefully we'll be able to have some updated data, maybe some change in that ratio too.
I'm hopeful, but I'm cautious because we also know that COVID has had a disproportionate impact on women. I did want to throw out a stat. You know, when we looked at, so looking back at the gender survey, we know that 23% of partners in CPA firms are women. But when we look at the state of the S&P 500 for women, 36% are mid-level, 21% on board seats, 5.8% are CEOs. So 5.8% of the Fortune 500 is women CEOs. That's pretty darn good. I was going to use another word. I shouldn't. And so does that mean we are behind, or are we tracking okay?
Good question. Hopefully that's what we can see coming out of the surveys. We ask a lot of the same questions over and over again to like collect continuing data. And it's hard to collect it right now since it is so different and so many women have left the workforce. Right. You and I have talked about how there's a cultural gender bias where when the pandemic hit, women carried, like you said, more of the weight of the changing world and the flexibility needed to make it through these times to the best of our abilities. But that underlying cultural bias is creating a very strong headwind for our ratios to change.
Absolutely. I mean,
so maybe not behind, but hopefully still pushing.
Yeah, pushing. And I think just this morning, I think we were exchanging, I sent you an article, you'd already read it. And it's really about the ongoing implications of COVID and its disproportionate impact on women. Even when the husband started to come back home to work from home. The wife comes back home and works from home, or the partners in a relationship. The childcare still fell on her. And the challenge we have culturally, I think you were talking about the norms. If a man takes care of their kid for an hour, we're like championing this guy and patting him on the back for stepping up, and because he hasn't done something like that before. Okay, maybe not an hour, but if there's a sick kid and they have to go take an hour or two away from the office, they get a pat on the back. And the woman, if she doesn't do that, we question her commitment, either as a mother, and if she does it, we say, was she committed to her career? I mean, we're a bit of a catch-22. Has that been what you've seen in terms of across your network and conversations you're having?
And at home. My husband's a CPA, so we work in the same profession. He's in a tax CPA, just like me. And I did carry more of the flexibility coming home. I was offered a lot of flexibility with my employer, which I was very, very thankful for. And he was too, but definitely saw where if I had to go take care of something and he was the provider of the child care, he got attention at work for doing it. Like, wow, that's so great that you're you're helping, which is great. But it definitely is something that we work in the same profession, the same thing. It was a stark difference in the reaction of who was taking care of those responsibilities and who was getting attention for it.
Right. The thing about bias is that some of us, those who are in the minority groups or those where the bias tends to have a negative impact on them, we sometimes internalize that bias. So there's some complexity there. But I also think as women, we naturally, for most of us, I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but there's this draw as a mother and there's a draw as a father just because of the way we're designed as humans. So that doesn't mean it's bad that your kid comes to you before the kid comes to daddy. It just means recognizing, I guess is your point, recognizing that it's not fair, that he gets a pat on the back and you get the, well, I would hope so response.
Yeah.
Was that frustrating though? I mean, sorry, I don't mean to pry. You don't have to share your personal stories. I'm just thinking about, how does that affect your ability? I mean, you're starting a firm. Is that why you're starting a firm? Because you needed to find a way to create balance, or are you just that entrepreneurial badass?
Entrepreneurial. I just wanted to have a new adventure, try something new, have something within my control after a busy 18 months of having a lot of things that went wrong that were outside of my control and outside of my husband's control, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in the world that was hard. And so leaving to start my own firm had nothing to do with bias or barriers. It was more of just wanting an adventure. But at home, we went through a book together called Fair Play. I can't remember the name of the author. I have to look it up. But it's a game that you play with your partner over who is carrying what cards at home. So, and carrying a card, like the full task, is thinking about the task and doing the task and following through with the task. So it's not somebody saying, hey, can you do the dishes, right? Because that's still one person thinking that that's a task that needs to be done. There's a manager of that project. So we went through that, and that's helped a lot at home. And my husband is great. He helps out. I mean, it sounds bad to say he helps out because that still perpetuates the bias situation. But that playing that game and seeing what cards each of us held, working within the same profession, was an interesting experience. And it's helped out too. Even just to go back to the gender bias thing and things that have recently happened and how ingrained it is in our culture. When I went out on my own to start my own firm, I went to my bank that my husband and I have banked with for 14 years since we got married. And I went to open a business credit card. And it should be really easy to go through the bank application, through your own bank login that you already have. And I was only able to set it up under my husband's name
Are you
I
serious?
couldn't switch it to me. I had to go into the bank and they had to manually override the system so that the application for the business ownership could be for me and not my husband. It has to do with just the name that's listed first, which a
Yeah.
lot of times is the husband's name listed first. Alphabetical in our household, his name comes alphabetically before mine
Yep.
for a first name. So it's to the extent of applying for a business credit card,
But it's
so
everywhere.
much there. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember the first time it sort of smacked me in the face was I was in practice and I was preparing tax returns for a couple. I happened to have whoever was the person who hired me was who was the taxpayer, and the spouse was the other one. So sometimes it was the woman and sometimes it was the man. And I recognize that we're having a very binary conversation, especially there's a question here about how does this relate to a same-sex lesbian marriage? And I want to touch on that, but in a moment. But I had a client the very first time, I think they were filing in a state that I'd never prepared the return for. And the return prints out of the system. I'm going through reviewing it. I'm not giving it any thought until I get to the state return. And for the state boxes on the form, it said husband, then wife. Only because of the order that I had put my clients in, it was backwards.
Wow.
And it dawned on me that I'd completely taken it for granted that the forms themselves were sort of neutral. So you're right about the whose name comes first for a number of reasons. Who knows why? I know on our bank account, by the way, I'm first because I was the one who opened the account and then we added him later. So, I mean, it's interesting stuff like that. My husband, by the way, stories, I don't know if I shared this with you. My husband was a full-time stay-at-home dad. And so the opposite impact of that it really told us a lot about gender norms. For example, if we were invited someplace for dinner or like a happy hour or social event, and they say, well, what do you do? And he says, I'm a stay-at-home dad. What he found is that people are like, huh. And then they drift over to somebody else and then the men stop talking to him. And so the social norms in our country kind of play both ways. I don't know if your husband's experienced that or if you've experienced that yourself.
We haven't experienced that personally. I do have relatives that the male spouse is the stay-at-home homemaker person, and it's a similar situation. You know, the first question is, what do you do?
Right.
Meet somebody. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think for men, the first what do you do question, it's the sizing them up. And for a woman, what do you do? It's interesting. But then when you talk about either your level or your role or the hours you work, other judgments come in. You're a mother and you travel a lot of times. You have a job where you're on the road all the time. And these stories start popping up in people's heads about sort of triangulating either your commitment to your profession and your career, your commitment to your family or to your kids or your marriage. Well, what about you? What about her? What does she want? What are her aspirations and dreams? Yeah. You're looking at me like, yep. What time is it? There was a question in here that said, would this be relatable to same-sex lesbian marriages? And I don't know if you have a thought on that. I know I do, but this isn't about me. This is about you. So,
partner at home carrying the cards doesn't, it can be any gender at home, right? And it's a partner at home carrying the same cards, making sure that it's fair at home.
Right.
That is important. In the article that you sent me, and I want to address this too, for like single moms working during the pandemic too, having that team player at home is important. And so with that article that you sent me of how remote work, almost more people who had the remote work option left the workforce, like more people did that way. I wonder about single moms and how hard it would be to balance all of those things without a teammate at home. So I do think it relates to same-sex couples. It's a partner at home. For single moms, they have different teams. That's different at home too.
I also think that in every relationship, there are the complexities of different power dynamics.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to say one person overpowering another, but I think there's a balance. And what I would hope, what I'm assuming, and I'm just going to show, for me, it's an assumption that there tends to be some, like the yin and the yang kind of idea, that there's a balancing in the personalities, but then that doesn't always translate into the balancing of responsibilities, the balancing of power, if you will, because when you get married, it's one thing. When you have children, it's one thing. When your career demands change, it's one thing. My boys are 24 and 26, and I can't imagine having had to make it over the last 18 months to 2 years with a young child. I don't know how you do it. I want to be like, sort of bow down to you, because it's a difficult position to be in. And if you are in, we could have the same sex question, whether it's a lesbian couple or a gay couple, because you still have this burden of balance. And how do you work through that? And gender bias goes both ways, by the way.
Yep.
So, all right, what was the other thing on this list? Hold on, let me go back, because I don't want to spend all day. All right, barriers, challenges, and supports, and stories. So we can go, let me look at this list. What are the barriers? Because a lot of companies mean well. Oh, wait, hold on. I know this is a bit early, but let's go to the second poll question before I ask you this question and see what the responses are. Can we do that, Jasmine?
Yes, we're getting that live on your screens right now. This is the second of 4 polling questions. Remember, you need to respond to at least 3 for full credit. This question asks, at your organization or firm, do any partners or leaders work flexible work arrangements? You have 3 options to choose from. Go ahead and cast your vote now. And thank you all for voting so quickly. We are above the 90% threshold. I'll give it another 10 seconds before I close.
I'm really curious about the results for this.
And closing down in 3, 2, 1.
64% say.
Wow.
Yes, that's encouraging.
Awesome.
So 64% yes, 18% no, 19% not sure. What's interesting about the not sure is maybe that's promising, because it means we're not really paying attention. So there's a lot of different ways to take that. But what I was going to ask you is, when we talk about some of the barriers, and one of the solutions supposedly is flexible work arrangements. Do you see that as a barrier or as a possible solution that employers can offer?
Both, because it is helpful. I benefited from a flexible work arrangement during all the shutdowns, loss of childcare, everything during the pandemic. Worked odd hours. It can create a couple things that are not as positive as you would think flexible work arrangements can be. We kind of touched on the burnout factor a little bit of working from home, particularly for working moms, also with school-age kids and the remote school work. That is a lot to carry at home while working on a flexible work arrangement. So the burnout factor on flexible work arrangements or working from home is one possible negative that can come from that type of arrangement. The other one is a disproportionate offering of opportunities. Right now, with still a lot of people working remote of all genders, hopefully what we're seeing is more equality of what's being offered to each employee. Before the pandemic, one of the things that was common was that a woman on a flexible work arrangement, or whoever on a flexible work arrangement, they were not offered the same opportunities of growth for somebody who was either physically in the office right next to, the managing person that can just walk out their door and ask them to do something. So there was a disproportionate offering of opportunities. I am worried as things open back up, as people return to offices, maybe more women in particular stay home for flexible work arrangements with uncertainties with daycare and school and possible school closures again. I'm worried about that. And that's why the onboarding process coming back to work is so important. So hopefully firms are thinking about that. And that kind of goes to one of your listing there is what can firms do with barriers, offering and looking and making sure that the opportunities for growth, like not taking people who have flexible work arrangements off of client-facing big jobs and putting them onto somebody else with the intent of trying to make it easier on all the things that they're balancing. What you're doing is just taking away opportunities for their growth and their progression in their career.
So if I can play devil's advocate then for a moment.
Yes.
Clients are looking for firms where firms that can be responsive to their needs. And I can understand that there can be challenges if people aren't available during business hours. And so, I mean, what do you say then to the person who thinks, while flexible work arrangements are great, we can't give you the same opportunities in terms of client-facing roles because the client is going to need you to be available all the time?
Mm-hmm. So it could be just making sure that the opportunity for growth is still available. So it could be maybe not that particular client, maybe a different one that's still showing progression in your career. That disproportionate where somebody who, I've had in my own journey, somebody outright say to me that it would be unfair if I was promoted because I was working on a flexible work arrangement, part-time schedule, because somebody who was working full-time was working more hours. Even if we were on the same progression of our careers and bringing in the same amount of clients and dealing with the same thing, it would be unfair because they were working more hours. It's the equal opportunities for growth and progression that's important.
Okay, so I'm going to continue the devil's advocate thing.
Do it.
Well, one of the things that we do in our profession is we quantify things. Mm-hmm. And so billable hours seems to still be of value, even though the number of hours I put on my timesheet, we know from the data is not indicative of quality of performance, leadership ability, capabilities and competency, but we rely on it. And so I can see how if somebody says I'm working 50 hours a week, because that's how many hours you need to put in to do a 40-hour work week in public accounting, I'm literally carrying a heavier load. How do I come back from that?
It's part of the underlying issue within our profession too, the billable hour. It's a hot topic, right? Looking at getting rid of billable hours, looking at value-based billing and evaluations, making sure that hours are lower in the total evaluation. Now, the people who work a zillion hours, like all the power to you, like you are really strong and doing really great. That's awesome. But the people who are working less hours also can be doing really great and really awesome and bringing in a lot of business to the company. I know from my experience over the last couple of years and even going out on my own, my clients, a lot of them are women business owners, moms. And the fact that I was working odd hours and they were working odd hours got me the client because we were both doing, oh, can I contact you after bath time tonight? Great, let's do that. So there's a need for that on the client side too.
That's a fair point. All right, so two other things I thought of.
Yes.
You were talking about working from home possibly being a bit of a disadvantage. And I thought, well, then that's true for anybody working from home, including men. So, I mean, if we're going to talk about leveling the playing field, it's important to acknowledge that these aren't just women issues.
Yes.
These are
Yes.
employees working from home issues. Is that
100%.
fair?
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
Yes.
Just trying to make sure we're playing fair. And then the other thing I wrote down is that we know from the data that men are also showing an increased interest in pulling back their hours, contributing more to the household, frankly, just balancing out their own work-life balance so that everything isn't about charging forward and doing 137% at work, but maybe leaving some space for personal growth, for family connection. If they're single, maybe having a life. So there's that aspect to it too. I just want to acknowledge that there are men out there listening, and this isn't just about us.
Yep.
We just know that women have a higher hill to climb, a steeper hill to climb,
Yes.
based on
Yes.
history and norms. So just for fun, I pulled up this stat that showed how in 1980, 33% of the workforce were women entering the profession. 33%. In 2018, it's 51%. So we've made progress, but look where we started. And men started the profession when accounting started. It was all men. So we've shown up into the profession roughly for the last 50 years and started to actually see meaningful progress in the last 20. So we're making progress. I don't want it to sound like we're just kind of bitching and complaining.
Yeah. And like talking about flexible work arrangements, I'm going off of historical data with women doing it in particular, because that's been, stereotypically speaking, in our research, the gender that has been taking it for the gender bias items we were just talking about, like taking care of children at home and taking a step back during those young child years. I am excited to see more men taking flexible work arrangements, looking for that in their careers. I think that's a generational change. I'm very excited to see that happening. My husband is at the firm that he's at. He had to go on a flexible work arrangement just to work a couple days from home before COVID, and then COVID hit, and we're all from home. But
do you know if that? Sorry to interrupt. Do you know if that changed as a result now that because of COVID that we now respect that could be restored back to a full-time job and still work from home?
Yeah. It was not a reduction in hours that he was applying for. It was just to work from home 2 days a week during tax season. And at his level, he was the only male at his firm to ask for that flexibility at that point in time. This was right before COVID. It was December of 2010. So he was all set up and ready for remote work. So that's good.
That's good.
But it is encouraging to see more men doing that. And I do think that will change our statistics and our data.
I think it will also increase the male voice in terms of sponsorship and advocacy, because when we have walked in someone else's shoes, we can appreciate their journey. It is no longer just an intellectual understanding. It's head, heart, and guts. There's a book, by the way, by that title, so I'm not stealing it. Because it's one thing if you tell me that you're experiencing something and I'm like, wow, I really feel bad for you. But it's another thing if I can appreciate what that feels like. I'm more likely to support you in more meaningful ways. So.
And the opportunity offering too, I hope would make it better. And just like the people who are working remote versus in the office, people on flexible work arrangements, reduced hours. Hopefully that becomes more of a commonplace where the seeking of the equal opportunities is going to be less burdensome and more just normal.
So in addition to flexible work arrangements, I know for our panel discussion over the summer, we were also talking about the leadership tracks. So for women, there's a disproportionate number of women who are in the non-equity partner roles in CPA firms. And the question of the day is like, it's a chicken and egg thing. Is it because that's a better role for a woman because she has these other competing priorities, whether she actually has them or whether they're projected onto women because of societal norms and business norms and expectations? Or is it because that's what women have been asking for?
Mm-hmm.
Women have said, this is the type of role we want because we don't want the pressures, the responsibilities, the expectations, whatever, real or perceived, about being a full equity partner.
Yeah.
Do you have any data? I'm sorry, I'm just like, I don't even know that we prepared, but I'm just coming up with questions. I can look up data if you need me to, but.
When we did that engaged session, we had an incredible historian and researcher, Dr. Elizabeth Almer, on the call with us. And this is her wheelhouse, and all of her amazing research that she has done, particularly for our profession, on women leadership opportunities and roles. And so she has data, and I'm sure it's in some of the, maybe even some of the slides that she had from our engaged session, but she was talking about how more of the non-equity positions within ownership of firms seem to be held by women or offered to women rather than equity roles. And it's that question of, is it something women are asking for, or is it something that it just kind of started happening from all of the reasons that we have just been talking about? She called it, if I remember correctly, is non-equity. I'm trying to remember her wording. Is non-equity positions or leadership in firms the new glass ceiling?
Yes, that's what it says.
That's the
Our
wording that
non-equity
she
positions
said.
with glass ceilings. Yeah.
Yeah, is that the new glass ceiling? Not having equity in our ownership.
So I'm looking at the slides, and she asked, do women prefer it because of flexible hours, less likely to require relocation, there's lower risk in terms of capital account requirements, reputational risks, job security, and then lower business development expectations. So it's preferred for those reasons. Or are firms encouraging it because they perceive that women don't want the risk? They don't think women have the right skill set. They don't have enough sponsorship or opportunities that are provided, or they find it's just easier to structure a reduced hour contract than it is to negotiate an equity contract with flexible work and flexibility baked in. Wow, that's a mouthful. I'm tired now just saying all of that.
It's a lot, I know.
But I just wanted to pull it up because that's what you were referring to.
Exactly. Yeah. Is it a new glass ceiling? Yeah, that is the question. And hopefully with some new data, I know she's actively researching and looking at this all the time. Hopefully with new data and maybe coming out of the recovery from the pandemic, maybe that'll be something that ends up changing too. But right now, it's where it is.
I'm really curious to see the data and how we start to see some pivotal shifts as a result of COVID, because a lot of the flexibility, the ability to work from home, the different ways we can work with clients, we had a whole lot of stories in the profession, and there was this holding on to the traditional way we've always done things because it's been successful, resistant to making some of these changes. And then we had to do all of these changes overnight, and we're like, we haven't broken. The profession is still working, so let's reconsider. So I can't wait to see what the data looks like 5 years from now. And if there was in fact a pivot, and if so, how dramatic was that pivot? All right, so I'm looking at the clock before you respond. Again, I don't want to get fired by our participants. So let's launch that third polling question, Jasmine, if we could.
Absolutely. Third polling question is up for all of our attendees live on your screen now. This question asks, have you personally experienced or seen gender bias? Go ahead and cast your votes now. As always, I will give you about 60 seconds or until we get 90% responses in. Oh, it looks like we are already there. Wow. Thank you all
Wow.
for voting so quickly. They
They
want
were
to get back to
already
that
ready already.
content. All right, I'll go ahead and close this down in 5, 4,
Well, hold
3,
on now.
2, 1.
That is impressive. Everybody on the webinar gets a cookie. Shoot. Now that I say that, I want a cookie.
I want one
By the way,
too.
Rosie, somebody went out and they gave you a shout out. I probably should have mentioned it specifically when I was introducing you, but congratulations on being named as CPA on CPA Practice Advisors 40 under 40
Oh,
list
thank
today.
you. Thank
So,
you.
yeah, no, that's awesome. And I appreciate that there are these lists that are recognizing women across the profession. There's always been the lists of like the top 15, 100 of this and that, but we're starting to recognize women in leadership because of the barriers to getting into those leadership positions. Congratulations.
Thank
Um,
you.
I don't even remember what I was saying before the polling question when I was like, don't answer that. Oh, I think it was the pivot. Are we expecting to see changes? Do you have any predictions or thoughts that you think, like ideas?
I have hopes. I have hopes. I'm hoping that the lessons that we have learned during this time of needing that flexibility, like you mentioned, is something that we can carry forward and actually have change, which is sharing the stories, right? And the power of stories, going back to that, just not forgetting some of the hardships that we've had over this last 18 months and making sure that that continues into the future and the considerations with leadership opportunities and flexible work arrangements and all of that. I'm just hoping that it continues. We at the AICPA with the Women's Initiatives Committee, we do a gender survey for public accounting firms every odd year. So we had that one that said 23%, like we talked about, which was from 2019. We passed on doing it in 2021 because of various reasons, but I'm hoping that we can collect it again in 2022 and see, hopefully not an outlier of something that happened during the pandemic, but a progression within that time period and trends hopefully continuing.
I moved us back to the discussion slide because when we talk about stories, I'm looking at the list of supports: mentorship, advocacy, community, and career modeling. And I think that there are stories in all of those. And I didn't know if anything jumped out at you. I'm looking at the time. We have about 18 minutes left, and I definitely want to leave some time for Q&A. So maybe we can spend a couple of minutes talking about those stories and why stories are important and whose stories are we talking about?
Yeah, our stories, our stories with what we've done in our careers, where we're at, what we're working with, what we're currently going through, what our hopes are. And the importance of sharing them is that instead of perpetuating the same story over and over and over again, we share to inspire the new CPAs coming up behind us to not have those same barriers and boundaries and inspire them to go through them or around them in a different way and not have that same Sally, right, happening every year, every time.
Sally, same as last year.
Sally, yeah, same as last year. I think accountants really like Sally. Who doesn't, right? It's easier. It's harder to face things that are different. It's harder to get into those situations, but sharing stories encourages that mentorship, creates that community, and does initiate change, because then we're going to the one right behind us and making sure that their story is different than ours.
I would add that it sheds light on the blind spots.
Yes, absolutely.
There's so much as women that we don't know. And I don't know about you, but when I started at Touche Ross, and I modeled my behavior. I changed the color of the clothes that I bought because I wanted to fit in, and I wanted to look the part. I wanted to act the part, but the part I was looking at to inform my actions and my appearance were men. And I have to tell you, I didn't think that was necessarily a bad thing because I didn't know that there was an alternative. I didn't wear dresses for the longest time in my career. I have some dresses now. It's also a preference. I prefer suits, but I have to say, I'll admit, I looked at dresses as less professional. Where do you even get this thought if it didn't come from pre-existing business norms? I don't believe that today, but I'll own that blind spot and acknowledge it and share it as a story to just poke a hole in it somewhere for someone else. Maybe it should have been popping balloons instead of sharing stories, but
Well, it offers an opportunity to look at different perspectives, right? Like we've all had different stories and things that have happened to us in our journeys and our careers and our personal lives. And sharing how we have gotten through barriers and have gotten through challenges helps other people through it too. So it helps opens your perspective to other people's experiences and stories so you can look for it too. You're not going to be blindsided, like you said.
it's also so reassuring to hear somebody and you're like, wow, it's not just me.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we power through things.
Yeah.
And, you don't complain. And I don't know that that's a gender thing. I think men do the same things. You just sort of power through it. It's what's expected of you, and we want to be helpful. We want to be supportive. Nobody wants to be the squeaky wheel. And we're all working to be really effective teams. So when you hit a road bump or a speed bump or pothole, I guess is what I should have called it, you just suck it up. You just move forward without realizing that maybe that wasn't the thing you needed to, maybe there was a strategy here that you could have employed. So
yeah. That's something that Dr. Ulmer brought up during our presentation too, was in her research and the things that she has, in the people she has interviewed, she has seen that women feel like they exhaust their equity in being able to ask for more assistance and more help to make things work. So sharing stories also encourages us that we're not asking for too much, or that somebody else is in the same position as us. We're not alone in asking for those tools or those opportunities. So yeah, stories are important.
it reminds me of sitting in a meeting and somebody asks a question. I'm like, oh, thank God, I'm glad you asked that. Because
Yeah.
all of us had the same question, but nobody wanted to ask. So
Yeah.
not that teed us up perfectly for questions, but I am going to try to, there are a lot of questions that have come in. Many of them are comments. And so I might not have time to shout them all out. Although I will shout out the first one. It's been here since the beginning. That excited to say I work for a Black woman-owned mid-sized CPA firm.
Awesome.
Is it possible to know if the woman cannot get into leadership or chose not to go into leadership? I guess that's a question that only she wouldn't be able to answer. Or maybe the question is there data that helps us understand this?
It's hard to collect data on that because it is such a personal story within individual firms. Some firms have very structural barriers into. So it's really difficult to collect data in that. We are working on trying to change some of our questions in the gender survey too, of being able to really get some of those specific leadership track questions. But with it being so specific to the firms and to the individual, it's really hard. I will say that one of the things that I've encountered and some of the things that I've seen talking to other people on leadership tracks and women in leadership topics is that a lot of times barriers in that journey are set up with the best intentions. She's dealing with so much at home. We should change maybe what offering that she gets in partnership. What are the things to look for in that? So I think in the answer to the question, no data to really know and support that, but look at the culture within the firm, have the conversation with that person and hear that person's story and see if there's something there.
Right. Yeah, no, totally agree. I totally agree. Somebody asked, can we get the name of the researcher? Her name is Dr. Elizabeth Ulmer, Almer. She's a professor of accounting at Portland State University. So Elizabeth Almer, PhD, CPA, at
She's
Portland
amazing.
State University. So there you go. Shout out to her. She's amazing.
She
and
is
yes, there will
amazing.
be one more polling question in case anybody's. There's been a couple of questions coming in. So,
Are you ready for that?
no,
last
not
polling
yet. We'll do
question?
that right at the end.
Okay,
We'll do that at the end.
gotcha.
I'm looking for. There were so many questions and so many comments. So I saw this one. It's a comment. I'm not in public accounting, and that's why I wanted to share it. I work for a company, and as a mom, my problem is that I would like to work part-time, which would be a stretch financially, but I know I can't handle it anymore. But when we cut back to part-time, somehow we lose our value per hour and our benefits. So for example, if I work half the hours in the year, I can't earn half the paid time off. And so instead we lose our paid time off and eligibility for some benefits. Are there any thoughts and ideas that can help empower someone to find a better way through challenges like this? Because it's a barrier for some women when they look at going part-time or working on flexible arrangements.
Yeah, that's hard. That's a lot of things that that person is dealing with. I think conversations, while difficult, sometimes can be so awesome in lifting that weight of uncertainty, right? We need to know what the other side is thinking and being able to communicate our needs and understanding why those are the policies that they have. Maybe there's something that they can do to work along with you, but that conversation is so important. And conversations are hard. They're really hard to communicate. Like, this is what I need. This is what I'm looking for. And the employer you're thinking is going to be like, this is the rule, but you won't know until you have that conversation with them on your need and what you're looking for.
So again, I'm going to play the devil's advocate.
Do it. Do it.
You're like, go for it.
Let's do it.
We talk a lot about uncomfortable conversations and difficult conversations, but there is, I know I would be afraid to ask some of those questions because I can't take the chance that even asking the question will immediately send a signal to my employer that I'm not as committed, I'm not interested, I'm just here for the money, I'm looking for an easy out, whatever the case may be. And if I don't know how to have that conversation, I'm just not going to have it. So that's one. And then the other thing I would say that I would not have thought of, the younger me would not have thought to just go get the data. Go look at the data that says how effective women can be. It's got nothing to do with hours or part-time employees. It's not, don't make it about gender. Try to be able to convey the business benefit. Maybe there are others in the organization who can rally behind this ask. I would have never thought to do those things, but I do think that it's too easy sometimes to say, have the hard conversation. It's different in every organization, the politics, the atmosphere, the culture, and some bosses, frankly, are jerks. And they can be women. Let's be fair. That there have been, and I know we've talked about this. Some women seem to hold back other women more than men hold back women.
Yep. Yeah.
The cat thing.
It's real. It's real. I did it this way, therefore you need to too.
Yes.
It's real. Absolutely. And I think one of the tools that could be helpful too is seeking a mentor, a coach. You can go through a lot of state societies, the AICPA, looking for a mentor or a coach that you can practice the conversation with, get some feedback on that, to get the courage, maybe a story from that other person to give you the courage to be able to go and have that conversation. And absolutely the data in the benefits of remote work, of flexible hours, the benefits that are associated with that, making the business case. There's actually a really cool tool on the AICPA Women's Initiatives website that is about making the business case for women's initiatives. And so there's some awesome business case data in that toolkit that you can pull to help make your case, or at least get you started on some of the research to make that case.
There's a comment from Amy, and I want to share it because what Amy says is, although it is hard to find good talent right now, now is the time to have the conversation. Employers across the board are having difficulty retaining people because of the Great Resignation, but they're also having even more difficulty hiring people. So there might be an incentive for employers today to consider some of those conversations that they wouldn't have considered before. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you, Amy, for sharing that.
Yes, thank you.
We don't have a lot of time left. So before there was I have to find it. Somebody was talking about being the rainbow in the room. Here it is. Diane said, quote, "I was always the rainbow in the room. I didn't really care what men thought, LOL." And so I applaud that because
awesome.
Being able to forge ahead despite barriers. I mean, you don't want to be a bull in a china shop, let's be fair. But one of my favorite quotes was, "Obstacles are only something you see when you lose sight of your goal." And the thing that it made me think of first time I saw it, I don't remember why, I think in pictures, the image that came up in my head is sort of like walking along a path. And there are stones and rocks and twigs, like if you're hiking. And if you look down, sometimes you stumble. But if you keep looking up, you sort of naturally sort of step over and around them because you're navigating the entire terrain. You're not trying to jump over individual objects. And so I just thought that was it was a life-changing thing for me because I was so busy focusing on the next hurdle that I never thought about the long game. Anyway, all right, it's 3:56. Do you have any final thoughts? Like, what's your great moment of wisdom or something you want to share with everybody?
That's my great moment of wisdom.
No pressure.
This wasn't one of the questions you prepped me with. No, I think that, and I keep going back to the power of stories and just making sure that it takes bravery in sharing your story. It takes a lot of bravery to do that. But by doing so, you are helping the pipeline and improving the data from 23% to hopefully something higher in 2022. You are becoming a mentor and a coach and creating a cultural difference by sharing your stories. So there's bravery there, but don't forget when you're jumping over the hurdles, like you said, to have that end game focus when you share those stories.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rosie. I was so happy that you could join me today and talk about this. We could have talked about this all day. We've talked about it a lot in the past, so thank you. I think it's important for us to, in the D&I conversation, which is one of the reasons I want to do this series, is we're often presenting. We don't dig deep in any one thing, and there's complexity and nuance. So thank you. And you were sharing your personal stories, so I appreciate that. Jasmine will do the last polling question. Just before we do that, though, I want to just thank everybody for joining us because I appreciate the continued support of this webinar series.
Awesome. And we appreciate having you. And I really have loved moderating with you today. Attendees, this is our fourth and final poll question of the day. Go ahead and cast your vote here. I'll leave this poll open for about a minute to allow everyone to get their responses in. But there is some great feedback in the questions panel, and I just want to offer my feedback as well. This has been very insightful and enjoyable to listen to you ladies go back and forth on these topics. So we're asking here, what's the most valuable part for you? Attendees, go ahead and let us know. Awesome. I will give this another 10 seconds. I know we're getting down to the wire here. Thanks everyone for their patience. And closing down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Awesome. You guys have any closing remarks?
Just thank you for joining us today. We appreciate the support.
Yes, of course, of course. I'm looking forward to the next time. Honestly, this has been really nice for me. Thanks again to you both for this presentation and for this discourse. This has been really insightful, like I mentioned. Always love learning something new. Now, we here at CPA Academy will go ahead and process your credit later today to all our attendees. That, along with a copy of this webinar and the handout, will be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. Please do keep a look in your email inbox because you will soon find an evaluation link for this webinar, and we'd love to hear your feedback about this session. And with that, we are just going to remind you all to please check the schedule on our website for additional information and courses, and we hope to see you all very soon on a future webinar. Thank you very much and have a great day, everyone.